So this morning, or before the coffee break, we went through a whistle tour stop of all of the various parts of the radar standard. And now we're going to go into a little bit of a deep dive. And we're going to start with the Rdr R message, the newest version published in September. It's the one that deals with reporting. That's the R for reporting. So, and for those who are still getting used to the fact that the radar standard has got 4 parts, this one's been named part 3 of the radar standard. So just as a reminder of what we're trying to achieve here. Okay, which is really what is the essence of neighboring rights, which in itself, I think, is rather complex. And we're trying to just capture the usage of sound recording, in this case, by broadcasters. It could be other performance revenue, but it also can be international revenue. It can be within one territory, one indie music licensing company collecting one set of rights versus another music licensing company having the mandate for other sets of rights. So there is a lot of communication going back and forth between various parties. And you can see on screen, the middle bit, you've got 2 pink squares representing music licensing A and music licensing B. Some of those music licensing companies are only collecting for certain rights and then have to report it back for those that have a mandate and claim it to pay it out to the ultimate rights controller. And I am by no means an expert in this space, and I very much rely on those sitting in the room. But the reporting message, despite the fact that we've designed it to be very simple, has to deal with a very complex business process. And we hope to make it easier in order for you all to communicate revenues, whether you are collecting, claiming, or paying. So a music licensing company has collected revenue from usages from a resource or from resources within a release, and may have received a claim from another music licensing company or from a rights controller, and will have to report those usages. And this can now be done very simply and effectively in a uniform way, using an even flatter file than the version before. So this morning we saw that the Rdr N notification standard has a set of messages, 2 of which are related to revenue reporting in XML. That is, I believe, no longer used. We had version 1.0 to make that process simpler in a flat file. And we have established 2 years ago that the implementation of that flat file message was still not generating the required and desired uptake, adoption, and implementation. Therefore, the working group has worked really hard to identify what the complexity were, and we have created version 1.1. Sorry. So 1.1 now caters for various scenarios. It has now 2 mechanisms for the reporting of revenues generated from that usage. The first mechanism is still the mechanism that was published in version 1.0. However, the experiences and change requests and backwards compatibility means that we have introduced some new fields and have worked on definitions, etc., etc. So it's a better version. And then we have got another mechanism to report the same set of data, but in a much more simplified way. The idea was that more simplified version of the same message as Rdr R 1.0 can be implemented without much IT input, resources, and time, and should be feasible to implement rather quickly by even the smallest players in the market. So at least that was the objective. We are now in a very good place. We've published it. We have the first exchange of messages that have already taken place, and we will be talking about that in more details. So the messages that we've created can deal with revenue attributable to rights controllers, but also the reporting of revenues attributable to performers. I think that is important. The messages need to be struck or need to be populated for either or. And I'm now talking only about the messages that we have simplified. So to reiterate what the previous slide was saying, the messages are also able now to be sent from a music licensing company to a rights controller, or from a music licensing company to another music licensing company, in order to deal with those bilateral multi-territory rights licensing agreement, or with any other territory-specific setups that may vary. So in summary, we have got two mechanisms. It deals with various revenues, for revenues that need to go to rights controllers or rights holders of sound recordings, but also deals with revenue that is attributable to performers, or what we call contributors. So considering that it deals with many different scenarios, whether the sender is in one country and the recipient is another, whether the recipient is a music licensing company or a record company, the messages in itself look the same. The content may be different, but the message looks the same. So the music licensing company has collected revenue for a resource, and having received a claim, wishes now to report it and possibly also pay out those revenues. And I think that just summarizes the previous slide. So here is the simple one-directional communication path, where it is really that the music licensing company is collating the revenue information. It has collected it, and the claiming party is the rights controller, and therefore the music licensing company is also the paying party and is sending the revenue report straight to the recording rights controller. And that will be right, the information will only contain the producer revenue allocated to the rights controller. And the three messages that you see there on the right are the three messages that Rdr R 1.1 contains: the revenue report, which references the 1.0 structure, and the two messages that convey exactly the same set of data, but is now split into a summary message and a details message. And I will explain that distinction a little bit later. So, Steffen, please interrupt me if I am going beyond the slides I'm supposed to go. So the two-step communication, which looks like this, is a bit more complicated and introduces some terminology that we have spent an awful long time to unravel in the working group. The reason is that the music licensing company, as I said, could collect, it could claim, and it could pay. So depending in where the music licensing company is in the process of collecting, claiming, and paying, the message choreography may vary. So I just want to introduce yourself to the concept of this collecting, claiming, and paying, which is a big part of the standard specifications, which may appear to be confusing, but actually only wants to convey the principles that we have that pink line with the loop, where music licensing companies have to communicate between each other. So it is the communication between the music licensing companies where they have to exchange data involved with various types of revenue before, in the end, the recording rights controller is being paid. So in that scenario, one music licensing company has collected revenue for which it has received a claim and wishes to then report these revenues to the claiming music licensing company. And this typically occurs then between music licensing companies that have international licensing contracts to do so. So what I think is important in this context is to obviously make very clear that a collection music licensing or a music licensing company that is collecting from the usages of a broadcaster, for example, sends only the data on to the other music licensing company that is relevant for the claims. So everything they collect in a period of time, only some of it will be sent over to the claiming music licensing. The rest, they pay directly out to the rights holders. So the left party would also then be a paying party, for example, for all of those revenues in their own territory, whereas the claiming music licensing company in that instance will aggregate what they collected internally, plus everything that was collected in a different territory. They collate all of that data for the rights controller they have to report and pay for. So that is more or less the choreography that this is trying to do. It makes the standard bulkier because we had to explain it. It's a concept that is very much part of the business process. It should, however, not scare you off to implementing the standard, because the message looks the same. Wherever you are in that process, it's a very flat, glorified spreadsheet with a minimum set of data that can be exchanged with all of the parties at various points of the process. So collecting and paying, collecting, claiming and paying, and in the end, the ultimate recipient are the recording rights controller who need to ingest the RDR R message. And the music licensing company, however, are the ones that are sending and receiving the messages. So from an implementation point of view, the rights controllers have an easy bit. They only need to wait for a message to come and ingest it. The music licensing company have to do an implementation of both export, sending, and recipient point of view. So now we are going to go and look at the messages themselves. As I said, two mechanisms. You've got the revenue report. No, not necessarily. Go ahead. But also Steffen knows the history better of the old structured message because he was involved in finalizing 1.0. I've only joined after, really, and still struggle.
You've already been speaking so much, so I can give you a break, a 5 minutes break, or 10 minutes break, and then you can resume on the most recent work on the standard and the most recent features. So you've explained, thank you. You've explained that the choreography may be very simple, may be more complicated, that you may have to carry quite complex data and carry all the variations in the different messages, but the message is really one message which can deal with all the data that you want to communicate. So no matter where you're sitting in the choreography and whether you're sending this message as a music licensing company to another music licensing company or to a rights holder, you're using the same message format. And the message format that was designed in the first version of the RDR R standard is still in version 1.1. Also, that's the revenue report message, and that can deal with all the communications that has just been explained. In addition, in the new version of the standard, in version 1.1, there is an additional set of 2 messages that can be used instead of using a single revenue report message. These are the revenue summary and revenue details messages. They fit together. So if you don't use the revenue report message, you use these 2 other messages. Vanessa has already mentioned several times that the reason why the revenue report message has been replaced or has been complemented by this pair of messages is that the revenue report message is a very nested message. It's complex because it deals with all the data in one message. So splitting it up into 2 messages allows for more flexibility. And additionally, flattening the structure means that it's easier to implement. Let's look at the structure of the message, the revenue report message as it was designed in Rdr R 1.0 and as it is still in the new version of the standard. It's, as it was already said, it's a TSV message. A tab-separated value message, which means in principle that if you're coming from the office world, from Excel spreadsheets, you take a row of an Excel spreadsheet, you extract it and paste it into a simple Word format, and you have the cells, the values of the Excel cells separated by tab characters. That's the TSV format. And every line in such a message is called a record. So your TSV message then starts with a header record, which has an identifier in the very first cell of the line saying RHEA, so record header or report header or whatever. And that's the single line which gives all the information about the administrative details of the message. Who is sending the message? To whom does the message go? When has the message been created? That's the information that is in the header record. And then you have records for all the data that you want to communicate. And you start with 1 or 2 RS01 records, which are summary records, which summarize your statement. And it's only later in the message that you will give the details. So first you have a summary which is in the statement summary record, and then this can be followed by 1 to n allocated party summary records, where you're still at the summary level, but where you're now splitting up the summary into the revenues depending on the allocated party. So you're getting more specific already. And then you list all the details. The details are related to the resources that have generated the revenue. If you have a sound recording, all the revenue generated by sound recording is dealt with using a sound recording revenue details record, which is identified by an RDR1 tag at the beginning of the line. So that's where you list all the revenue details that a specific sound recording has generated. So in that line you would identify the sound recording, you would give its ISRC, you would identify the amount that came in that was collected, and then you would list, for example, all the deductions, taxes, whatever is changed there to get to the final net amount that you're paying out or that you would like to pay out for the specific sound recording. And then you do the same for any audiovisual resource revenues, or and you have then a third variant of this revenue details record for other types of revenues. And that's all listed in your message. And then once you've listed everything, you put in one line at the end, which is the footer record, which summarizes what has been communicated in this message, which gives you the total number of lines so that you know how much data has been communicated in the message, and you can verify and validate that you have all the data in your processing. That's quite a complex structure because it involves this nesting with many multiple messages, and it was then thought that it would be easier to deal with this by having two messages, by separating the summary and the details into two messages rather than handling them at different levels in one single message. So now we have two separate single record messages. We have the revenue summary message and the revenue details message. And the more important message is actually the revenue details message. That's what you want to communicate in a standardized way. So you would like to have a simple message starting again with a header record, which then has one type of record which applies to all the types of resources for which you've generated revenue. So whether it's sound recordings, videos, or whatever, you use the same SRD1 record, which is shown here. And so it's really the same format for all the lines in your message, except for the header record and the footer records that you could put at the bottom of your file. And then when sending out these revenue details files, you have two options. Either you complement them by a revenue summary file that you send out that summarizes all the details, and you then need, of course, a pointer between the two messages to say that this summary is related to these details, or you send your summary in another structure. You can send an email with an attachment of some format which just summarizes things. But so the important part here is the revenue details message, which may be complemented by a revenue summary message. This is a slide which should summarize everything that I've already said. Is there anything that I didn't say yet? No, I don't think so. Happy with what I said?
Sorry, any question at this stage? It's just explaining the structure. So one document that outlines the specifications for the Rdr and Rdr R 1.1 includes messages that are in both, so one message in the old structure and two messages in the new structure. So the addition of it is the two new flat messages. And I would like to go and concentrate now just on those two messages that we call revenue summary and revenue details. So the important message, as Steffen mentioned, is really the revenue details. And it is also the only one that is mandatory. The revenue summary message is an optional message. It is optional because in order to allow faster adoption by as many as possible, we felt as a working group that it is important that current existing business processes are not interrupted as much as possible. And very often, revenue summary messages or statements are possibly sent to a completely different party internally than the detailed breakdown of that revenue that may go to a different department. So you've got one going to the finance department and another one going to the royalty department. The one going to the finance department may still be sent via PDF, email, or any other means. It's the detailed breakdown that we felt is important is sent in the same structure so that it can be ingested, analyzed, and more efficiently, more accurately, etc., etc. So just to spell it out, it also means that having split it into a summary and in a details message and having flattened it, it means that now for one, what we call distribution cycle for a music licensing company, which that kind of timing phase may differ from music licensing company to music licensing company. Previously, you could just send that one message. However, now you need to structure it slightly differently, and it means that for one distribution cycle, you may need to send more than one details message. And that depends what type of revenue you deal with and who your recipient is. So if your recipient is a rights controller, then your message will only show revenue with a statement type cell indicating rights controller. If a music licensing company is sending it to another music licensing company, the music licensing company has a choice between statement type rights controller or statement type contributor. So two different sets of revenues, which now cannot be really mixed up in one message. It was previously possible to do that in one message in that very nested way in the various records. Now you need to send one message for one set of revenues and one for another. And very often it depends who you're sending it to. Obviously, the rights controller would not want to receive a message, detailed message, with statement type contributor. So that is trying to explain the first set, and this is one of the wordy slides. I left it as such because I do believe that it will be helpful later on if you decide to implement the message. So each of the records in the new one called SRD1, it's the same record for whatever you want to populate. And the message will look the same, but you may populate different fields. And we will show later on a set of data that is very specific to a message sent to a rights controller with a statement type rights controller. And then when you have statement type contributor, you will have to list revenue that is very specific to an allocated party. And then you have to complete all of the data relating to that allocated party. And you've got allocated party full name, allocated party identifier. You have various fields that just identify that allocated party. Obviously, these are fields that you would leave blank if you were to send statement type rights controller for a message to record companies. And the flexibility that Steffen mentioned earlier with regards to splitting it in two messages and having summary revenue detail and then details revenue data means that you can have now within a single distribution one revenue summary message for all of the details that you're sending. You can have a summary, like for every detailed message, a summary, or you can have no summary. So that allows you more flexibility depending on what process you need to implement internally. The other thing to remember when simplifying the message is that each of the records now are specific to not only the statement type, but you also need to have a record that applies to only one use type, one single territory, and then if it is contributor for one allocated party contribution role. So if you have if you have to report revenues for a specific use type or one use type in several territories, you will have to list that use type over and over again. Just give use type broadcasting in territory 1, use type broadcasting in territory 2. So you need to split the records up in one message to clearly distinguish between use type, territory, and allocated party. And then I think what is important in the header is that you do specify your distribution date, because the various messages can all refer to the same distribution cycle. So this brings me to showing that actually a message that is extremely long, because we had to flatten all of the fields from the previous format for the various records. But if you take out all of the columns that are for audiovisual, if you take the columns out for contributors and you only want to send a message from a music licensing company to a record company, you really only have to populate those cells. These are the mandatory fields. And I am highlighting that obviously you as business partner may have contractual obligations that stipulate that you have to add some other fields that are, from a technical point of view, not necessarily mandatory. So that list could potentially be longer depending who you're exchanging the messages with. But and you will also have to send the full message that is definitely more than 15 lines long. However, you leave the cells blank, but all those cells are required to be populated, and it's not really a lot. You have to specify the record type, you have to give the record an ID, you need to specify in which currency the revenue is being exchanged in. You have your net revenue in that currency. As I said, you need to specify whether that file is showing revenue for a rights controller or for a contributor. You then get to be the paying music licensing company, because you are sending that revenue report to the rights controller. You are sending it to somebody, which is record company Y in that instance. You need to identify whether the record is for a recording or for a music video. In another scenario, it would be for resources in the audiovisual content, but then you would have other fields to populate. You have the opportunity to send a proprietary resource ID, and I need to specify that the ISRC, and the documentation will say that it's the ISRC the MLC has in their database and sends it to the rights controller. ISRC is in that list, although it's not mandatory in the specifications. The working group has written a knowledge base article to clearly indicate the importance of sending an ISRC if available. And I want to stress it, that if you have one, send it. It's here in the example because it's so important, despite the fact that the specification allows you not to send one. It's conditional in respect to the proprietary resource ID. Then obviously, if you're sending revenue related to a specific sound recording in a specific territory, you would want to give it a display artist name. You will be communicating your share percentage that you're allocating to the rights controller. You have then the total gross amount and then the net amount. And some of that will obviously lead back to the summary information that may or may not be sent in the, together with the detailed message. So all in all, it's not that much. There are many, many more fields. But I think in the spirit of a quick, speedy, easy implementation, I would expect that all of those fields are already in systems that could be communicated in this format.